Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us again on the Ducks Unlimited podcast. We have in the past talked about wetland conservation programs in various parts of the country. Today, we're going to be visiting with someone in the Atlantic Flyway to talk about some of the wetland conservation efforts that have been in place for many years out there. We received some input from our listeners over the past few months, and one of those comments was like, hey, let's hear some more about some things that are going on in the Atlantic Flyway. So this episode is in response to that comment, and we always appreciate that comment. So specifically today, we're going to be talking about something known as the ACE Basin project. There may be other names for it, and I'm going to let our guest explain all the details of that, but it represents some fairly significant wetland restoration, wetland conservation efforts that have occurred in coastal South Carolina. To help us with this conversation, I'm going to welcome in Dean Harrigal. In his current position, he is a consulting wildlife biologist for Folk Land Management, and he is retired from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. I think he wore very many hats in that agency, and so I'm going to let him tell us more about that. But Dean, welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
Let's start with a brief intro of you and your sort of personal bio, professional bio. You've, as I said, you're retired from South Carolina DNR. So to most people, they will interpret that as meaning you have a few years under your belt. So tell us just thumbnail sketch about your travels in this field.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I'm a Clemson man, not once, but twice. BS and MS from Clemson University. I'm a native South Carolinian. I grew up in Aiken County along the Savannah River. I grew up with a fishing rod in one hand and a shotgun in the other, and with parents who took their children afield. After I finished my master's degree, I went to work for a small sporting plantation here in the Ace Basin, managing habitat, where I learned how to get my boots muddy and my hands dirty, and spent time managing habitat there, and then transitioned over to state employment around 1990 and spent a full career there for 28 years doing various things for SCDNR. The last 25 years, and the most enjoyable, were in the Ace Basin managing wildlife habitat, working with waterfowl management for our state. So did a lot of things, dealt a little bit with alligators, some with whitetail deer, but most of the time I enjoy working with habitat, and especially wetland habitat.
Well, it sounds like you have tons of experience, and you're exactly the right person for this conversation. You and I had, first got acquainted last year as we were working on a particular an article that actually appeared in the Wildlife Society Bulletin. It's a professional journal, and it was an article that was highlighting the importance of private lands in wetland conservation for waterfowl all across North America. We had several vignettes within that article related to some key wetland restoration conservation efforts across North America. One of those, under one of the particular topics, related to a lot of the very impactful work that has occurred in coastal South Carolina in this ACE Basin. And so naturally, you're the person we wanted to have tell us more about that. As we've alluded to in other episodes, conservation for waterfowl, whether we're talking about grasslands or wetlands, takes place on public land, on our state and federal properties, as well as private land. We simply cannot support waterfowl populations on public land alone. We have to work on private land in order to make this big engine that is waterfowl populations and waterfowl population management turn. And so that's where some of the work that we're going to talk about in coastal South Carolina comes to play. So let's just start. I said we're going to talk about the ACE Basin Partnership, or the ACE Basin Project, or whatever other names we want to assign to it, or that there might be for it. But ACE Basin, that's ACE Basin. Dean, let's just start off and tell us what ACE stands for?
ACE stands for the Ashepoo, Combahee, and Edisto rivers, which are three rivers that empty into the St. Helena Sound and create the Basin, which is the large watershed that drains a good chunk of coastal South Carolina between Charleston and Savannah. The three rivers are tidal rivers, which means that the tide comes and goes up and down the rivers with a layer of fresh water riding on top of the salt water wedge that moves up and down the river, which creates a really unique situation for managing habitat. Historically, in the colonial days, wetlands in the Ace Basin in this tidewater region were converted from their original habitats, which was either tidal freshwater swamps or tidal freshwater marshes, into agricultural land, where rice was the principal commodity grown during the colonial through the Civil War era. And then after the Civil War, or the war between the states, however you want to call it, these things fell in disrepair, and they were purchased by rich northern industrialists as winter recreational retreats because they provided good hunting opportunities.
What a lot of people don't realize, probably a lot of people don't realize, is that rice in North America first came about in South Carolina, at least as I understand it. You can correct me if that's not technically accurate, but that's...
You're correct, yes.
And so, nowadays, rice is grown in Mississippi, Arkansas, Missouri, Louisiana, Texas, California. That's where the majority of the production occurs. There is, I understand, maybe it's a reemergence of custom rice varieties in South Carolina. Is that right?
There was a rice variety called Carolina Gold that made these planters incredibly wealthy. And there's been some emergence in what I would call niche farming, boutique crops of redeveloping and re-commercializing this rice for sale in a small scale fashion. The lands in the lower Midwest, the Mississippi alluvial valley, are more suited to heavy duty agricultural equipment than the coastal lands here in South Carolina. So people are planting it on, tens of acres and hundreds of acres, boutique marketing it versus the large scale that y'all have out in that part of the world. Rice was king. Some of the richest people in North America in the early colonial period were from South Carolina. Georgetown and Charleston, they were built upon the rice economy.
So we have the rivers emptying into the estuary here, and so we have the coastal marsh as part of this important region. But the Ace Basin, as it's known, actually extends quite a bit inland, and it encompasses some other vegetation communities, the waterfowl habitat types. Tell us about those.
We have the coastal areas that are really focused, but all of these riverine systems, the Combahee, the Edisto, the Ashepoo, they have tidal freshwater swamps. They have the forested wetlands. All of those things are very important for waterfowl and all the other species that utilize that type of habitat. Everything from Mississippi kites to prothonotary warblers, wild turkeys. So what you have in the protection of this big landscape is a good chunk of an ecosystem that is protected along the river corridors, extending down to the coastal areas. So, it's a landscape scale. It's not a duck pond here or a hardwood swamp there. It's the blending of the two together in its transition from the uplands into the salt marsh, which is another part of the basin, which is very, very important also. And, if you're a duck from a bird, I always look at it from a bird's eye view. 190-acre pond in a wintering situation doesn't generally provide everything you need. But if you got 10 times that or 20 times that, there's a lot out there that they can utilize. And if something isn't quite right in one area, it could be right in the other. Nature is never 100% consistent in all places all the time.
And that's what, Dean, makes this situation, the history, the legacy of conservation in the Ace Basin so magnificent, you might even say, is the scale at which it has occurred. When you go back, you wind the clock back far enough, there are places all across the continent that would look like the area that we're talking about now before we as humans had the impact on it that we naturally do. But what's different about this Ace Basin region is the degree to which so much of that habitat as it occurred sort of pre-colonial times has been kept intact. But hey, this is the Ducks Unlimited podcast. Talk to us a bit, for those that may not be familiar with that South Atlantic region. What are the most important, most common waterfowl that you see in that area using those habitats in that region?
Of course, wood ducks are a large portion of our waterfowl utilization in the Ace Basin, and that concentrates on the hardwood swamp, the river corridors there. You've got a lot of potential natural habitat flooded during the winter time in these hardwood swamps and forested wetlands. Out in the open marsh, the lower regions of the Ace, green-winged teal, gadwall, blue wings, widgeon, pintail, some mallards, what I would call the traditional puddle duck species, utilizing the managed wetland complexes in the old rice fields. You get further out into the pure tidal marsh in the open sound, you see some of the diver species, bufflehead, canvasbacks, redheads. We do the scaup species, mainly lesser scaup. We do see some of the true sea ducks out in the St. Helena Sound from time to time. So, you can have a wide variety of birds present at any given time during the winter. Bread and butter bird for most hunters are green-winged teal and wood ducks.
What about black-bellies? Have black-bellied whistling ducks made it to South Carolina?
Black-bellied whistling ducks are here. One of the first sightings in South Carolina, actually, I made it in 1994 at the Donnelly Wildlife Management Area. And
my goodness.
Yeah. I'm smiling right now because that was like the last thing I thought I would see. And they have pioneered up here in fairly respectable numbers. They're around during the summertime. We saw a bunch just the other evening. And, we've done some research on them. The populations kind of move up and down the coast. We think what happens is black bellies make a regional migration. They're here during spring and summer. They arrive late. They breed. They hang around. When a cold snap hits in early November, they go south. We did a pretty interesting banding project when I was with DNR, where we hung color bands from half a dozen different states on the birds, and they went everywhere. We had birds that our color was blue. We had birds show up in New Jersey.
No kidding.
The first rocket net shot we made on the Savannah National Wildlife Refuge, we caught a bird that had been banded in Louisiana. And then we had birds that they were all over the map. And when I told my wife about it, she said that just proves they're about as crazy as they look.
And hey, they have continued to prove that true. They are all over the place. They are in urban settings. They are in rural settings. There's big populations in New Orleans. There's some here in Memphis. They are just all over the place, and their range expansion continues. They're really a remarkable story.
It's very interesting. But one thing here in South Carolina, they leave just as hunting season starts. And so, if you talk to people in Georgia, they'll see them pass through. And it seems like everybody goes to Central Florida to winter, before they disperse back, at least on the South Atlantic coast. They're a hoot.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to have to talk more about those on a future episode. But let's get back to the Ace Basin. The South Atlantic is, of course, a really important area. The Ace Basin in particular for Ducks Unlimited and a lot of the conservation work that we do there. We have a field office in, I believe it's in North Charleston, South Carolina there. I've actually never been to our field office. I've spent very little time in that region. Something I need to correct. But I mentioned the scale at which this ecosystem conservation, you might even say, in the Ace Basin has occurred. And again, it's not by coincidence. So I think the history of how this came about is really important. A lot of folks will not know about, but they will find it interesting. So let's turn back the clock a little and just let you describe how that came about. Who were the people that were involved in this? What caused them to invest in this conservation? And we're not talking just about restoration or enhancement. We're talking about the protection, perpetual protection, set aside the key, large tracts of land for conservation benefits. Tell us about how that story unfolded.
A very interesting story. Of course, it all started on a continental scale with the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. That was the big blueprint that put everything out on the table. 1986, it was ugly for waterfowl populations. And that's when the U.S. and Canada, and Mexico finally got together with U.S. driving, starting it and say, what can we do? How do we do it? And, the goal is to restore our wetland, our waterfowl populations. Well, habitat's the key. How do you get habitat? Well, you got to restore it and protect it. So from the North American Waterfowl Management Plan blueprint, of course, there were areas picked out. There's the Mississippi Alluvial Valley there's the there's the Atlantic Flyway, and we were, South Carolina was part of the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture. The joint ventures were the big regional projects, and then within the regional coordination, there were individual projects called focus areas. And some of our administrators and field biologists where are the important areas in individual states? I'm sure that was the question that was asked.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where are based upon your knowledge, where are? Well, in South Carolina, two major obvious areas was the Santee Delta and Winyah Bay region north of Charleston and the Ace Basin region south of Charleston. And they became focus areas under the Atlantic Flyway joint venture. And that's how it all got started.
Dean, I also wanted you to talk about, and maybe you're going to get into this, the conservation ethic that developed even prior to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. You're absolutely right that on a continental scale with respect to waterfowl populations, that was a pivotal moment in contemporary conservation. But wasn't there some work, sort of an emerging conservation ethic in that region that came about prior to all that?
The big thing in the Ace, because of we had the rice planters had a very strong conservation ethic because they had to live and make money off the land. And when rice went out and the northern industrialists, and I'm talking about people like Baruch, Gaylord Donnelly, and in the early part of the 20th century, these guys recognized this was a good place to spend the winter. So they started purchasing these large blocks of land for their recreational interests. And they would get on the train in New York or Philadelphia, overnight down here to the Low Country, and spend their time hunting ducks in the morning, hunting quail in the afternoon, and enjoying the warm sunshine in between. And they protected these pieces of property with quite a plum. They were proud of them. And that ethic was just passed along. They managed the forest, they did some agriculture, but the wetlands were something to enjoy, not something to drain and fill. And what happened with the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, it formalized everybody's ideas. Somebody wrote it all down. Why are we protecting these places? And why do you hold on to a 5,000 acre piece of property that's expensive to maintain? Because it's really important to me. And that importance was just passed along. And when the North American plan, it kind of codified everybody's feelings. This is why we do it. And what NAWAMP did in the focus area concept was encourage local partnerships, which was very important to getting it going. The states can't protect and manage it all. The feds can't protect it and manage it all. The private landowners, they can't protect and manage it at all. And so the focus area concept got partners to the table, sometimes disparate partners. Another key thing that came along in the large scale protection of this landscape was the conservation easement tool, which is, to me, the most important tool of the latter 20th century and through today's times of protecting land on a landscape scale. And so when the partnerships were put together, the feds like to hang cool names on things, the task force. So we created the Basin Task Force, and the original members were the organization I worked for, which was that time South Carolina Wildlife and Marine Resources Department, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, and private landowners. Those were the original partners. And private landowners were important because they were the people who want to know what was going to happen to their land if all these other folks showed up. I always found ducks and TNC to be very interesting because you look across the table and the TNC folks are looking at Ducks Unlimited. Y'all are not anything but a bunch of duck hunters.
That's right.
And the Ducks Unlimited people looking across the table, y'all are nothing but a bunch of tree huggers.
Yeah.
Well, what do duck hunters and tree huggers have in common? The dirt.
That's right. There is still some commonality even among those groups, between those groups.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And believe it or not, I have met a lot of my career, a lot of very strong conservationists who are members of both, and
Absolutely.
they see it.
Yeah.
And so that diverse partnership created a lot of thinking and a lot of talking and a lot of saying, how can we take advantage of all the opportunities out there?
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
Dean, it's not as though the idea of partnerships and working together was completely foreign. I'm sure there was some level of partnership that was occurring prior to that, but as you mentioned, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan really provided impetus for that, and also gave that, provided that common, an articulation of that common goal, and that they could all, folks could all get behind and collectively move forward. And so we see that all across the country, where the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and the continental goals, the regional goals, provides that galvanizing force for all these different partnerships. And we've actually seen that model replicated through, again, across the country, across the continent, for other conservation purposes, again, just demonstrating the value of that type of framework.
Yeah, and, I'll put it in Clemson terms for you. It's all in,
Let's not get too carried away now.
Oh man, I got the floor.
That's
but,
right.
but and it was a way to get these different groups to the table. And in the Ace Basin, where we've had such great success, it has been the Fish and Wildlife Service. It has been DNR doing their roles, but it has been the private landowners and the NGOs providing that bridge and providing options for landowners like conservation easements that will help them protect their land for prosperity. It has been DNR and the Fish and Wildlife Service stepping in to fill gaps. If there's one of our goals in the Ace Basin project was to provide, protection to key pieces of property that provide public access, and the Fish and Wildlife Service and DNR have done that in companionship, and in a much bigger way, the private landowners working with the conservation organizations. I call TNC and DU the big boys because you're national, but local land trusts have stepped in to help fill the role of giving people options of how to do a conservation easement. So what you got is you got a patchwork quilt of protected habitats. There are private lands habitats whose qualities are just incredibly high. And why? Because the landowner has that ethic to want it to be that way. Ducks Unlimited and other conservation, if it's wetlands, DU steps in to help them. So it's kind of it's so interconnected that it's hard to describe. But here again, the whole goal is protection of the landscape in a conservation method. That's what makes it so cool.
Yeah, so the ACE, if my reading is correct, the Ace Basin Project, or the task force, you can correct me on this, it came about in 1988, is that right?
That is correct. We just celebrated 89, I think, 88 was when it was chartered. Got really rolling about 89. 2019, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Ace Basin Project.
And you've been there for just about the entire, or I guess it would be the entire thing, right?
Yeah, almost. I drifted away when I was still in the plantation business. It was getting started, and I drifted away for a few years because I got sentenced to our Columbia office for 2 years. But then I got back down here, as it was really getting going. So for over a quarter of a century, I've been right there with it. And it's been one heck of a ride.
Well, let's talk a bit about the scale of the accomplishments. I also want to emphasize again the protection aspect, and the reason we kind of singled out this Ace Basin Partnership Task Force, whichever of these, the Ace Basin effort. In the article that I was referencing earlier is just because of the way the easement that you referenced has been used so successfully in that region. There are a number of easement programs. These are voluntary easements. All of this conservation work is voluntary. If it's it's a key point here, whether it's public land, private land, it's all voluntary participation in these programs. But the easement programs are used widely in the prairies when we're talking about putting perpetual easements on grasslands. And what those easements basically mean is that the landowner is either paid or they donate the value for that's equivalent to some development right that they're giving up.
Most of our early easements, the really big ones, the landmark easements like Ted Turner on Hope Plantation, the Donnelly family on Ashepoo and Fenwick Islands, and Mr. Lane on Willtown, those were donated easements. Pond plan, So significant gifts to conservation.
Absolutely. And so it's a common tool in the prairies, but they're less widespread. Their application is less widespread in migration and wintering areas from a waterfowl standpoint. And the Ace Basin is a notable exception to that.
Those big cornerstone easements set the stage and set the example. I think that's a big thing. They set the example for others to follow. And, the Donnelly family is one of the most well-respected families in wetland and waterfowl conservation in the nation, or in general, and then that just, Mr. Donnelly was wide and far-ranging thinking. A lot of people called him the godfather of the Ace Basin Project, and that he sat in the background and made sure what was done right. And, his history with DU, everybody, I'm sure but he was one of the people who helped start DU. So it's very important.
Absolutely. Dean, let's talk a bit about the scale of these accomplishments. Now, we've referenced 1988 as sort of a starting point for the formalization of this Ace Basin Partnership in support of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, and so that might be a good bookend to use. In terms of how you inventory all these accomplishments. I know you have some of these rough numbers handy. Just talk to us about the acres, the dollars. What kind of impact has this partnership brought to that area?
Well, when we first started the project, our original goal was to protect 50,000 acres in a 90,000 acre block. And things took off, and just over the course of the years continued to grow. And this past year, we celebrated our 30th anniversary by protecting over 300,000 acres through conservation easements as the primary tool, And the big thing about the Ace Basin Project is, the original focus was on ducks and duck habitat, but it only took 3 or 4 years, if that long, for it to turn into landscape scale land protection. Not only the wetlands, but the adjacent uplands. Where does protection of water quality start? On the uplands. And then we started realizing that we had carved out too small of a piece of the low country to protect, because we didn't include all of the river corridors and the surrounding lands. And so we redrew the boundaries from the original 90,000 acre camel, as we called it, which was basically lands east of 17 or east of 17A, into 1.1 million acres. and which extended way up inland, and it encompassed the swamplands, some of the isolated freshwater wetlands. Everything goes to the ocean, so protect as much of it as you can. And so, with a 1.1 million acre project there, that's pretty big. When you think about it, we've protected approximately a third of it.
Wow.
That's, it's hard to describe it,
Yeah.
to come see the Ace Basin in all of its habitat types. You can't do it in a half a day. You need to take 2 or 3 days so you can see, you can start at one end or the other and follow the flow of the water. Start in the swamplands and the where I was this up in the freshwater swamps, and follow the flow of the water down to the salt water and all the different things that you see. And it's pretty amazing, and we continually pick up conservation easements along and along, and it's really fascinating to watch it play out. The core waterfowl habitat is east of 17 in the historical rice field country. That's the core traditional wintering waterfowl habitat, with a little bit on the other side of 17. But the rest of it's pretty spectacular, too.
And I imagine it's immensely rewarding for you personally to see the continued progress that's made under that partnership. And that kind of conservation work doesn't happen without financial resources. Talk about that in a few sentences. What level of financial investment are we talking about? What's the source of those fundings?
Well, NAWAMP's a plan. The North American Wetland Conservation Act is the checkbook that helps implement the plan. And in the ACE, there has been about $5 million worth of NAWCA grant funds that have been matched with about $3 million for wetland enhancement and some wetland security, mainly purchases of the lands for the Ace Basin National Wildlife Refuge. And those NAWCA grants have been used to enhance wetland management on public lands and private lands. It's all about the plumbing, and to get those habitats in shape where you can effectively manage them.
Listeners of the show are going to hear about NAWCA if we haven't already played the episode by now. We'll hear about NAWCA in the Texas coast as well. Dr. Todd Marandino over there is one of the people that helps lead the Texas Prairie Wetland Project, another private land wetland restoration conservation program, and it too gets some of its key funding from the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. We'd just like to point that out to all of our listeners, because regardless of where we are on the North American continent, there are North American Wetlands Conservation Act dollars at work to help protect, restore, and enhance key wetland habitats that support waterfowl populations continentally. Now, my understanding, Dean, is that there's, again, anytime we're involved in one of these big efforts, there are an immense number of partners, an immense number of resources that they all bring to the table. I believe I remember something about the South Carolina Conservation Bank being a somewhat recent development that has had a tremendous impact on resources available for this. Is that right?
Right. One of the things the Conservation Bank is a really good tool in South Carolina. It is what it says it is. It is a banking instrument that provides grants for conservation-oriented purposes, whether it's purchasing a piece of property, helping to buy an easement on a piece of property, helping to secure a grant. So what we've got in the mix in the bank, it takes cash. You always got to have a match. And The Conservation Bank is a source of cash. Some of our larger counties have greenbelt funds that they can use. And the third source of match, which is real important, is the value of easements, that can be used to match. So to prove that you're worthy of a NACA grant to do wetland, to do habitat enhancement, or to secure an important piece of property, you've got to prove that the property is worthy of that investment, but that the people who are promoting the investment have the financial wherewithal to meet that match. And that's where the South Carolina Conservation Bank comes into play. That's where DU and TNC and the local land trusts have the value of matches that they can play towards a NACA grant, which has gone a long way a lot of times in securing important pieces of property and important enhancement projects. It's a bunch of pots of money to get the job done. Like you got to have a lot of partners and you got to have a lot of pots of money.
That's exactly right. And I've talked a lot about and promoted the importance of easements and perpetual protection of properties in the ACE Basin. But it's not just that. There's a lot of wetland restoration. There's a lot of wetland enhancement activities that also occur through these projects, right?
Right. Just about, when I was with DNR, we worked closely with DU on two major projects at Bear Island Wildlife Management Area, putting together, upgrading our water delivery systems, bringing things that needed enhancing into line. And, the combination of having the expertise of DU's engineering staff and grant writing capabilities in helping us improve the habitat management capabilities on state, federal, and private lands has gone a long way in the ACE to elevate our ability to effectively manage our wetland habitats.
Dean, I thank you for all the work that you've done through the various positions that you've had over the course of your career, and perhaps you're continuing to serve some of those functions now. I'm not exactly sure what all your daily activities are as a wildlife consultant, consulting wildlife biologist. But nevertheless, I thank you for that. I mentioned earlier that I have not spent much time in coastal in the South Atlantic, coastal South Carolina. I've been there a few times, but for any of our listeners that may be in that same boat with me, are there any suggestions, any advice that you could give people on how to visit, how to see some of these important areas?
Well, don't come in August.
Rule number one. Great.
No, actually, probably the best time to come and really enjoy the ACE Basin is February, March, April through early May. I love February and March because you're in the transition of seasons. Waterfowl are getting ready to migrate. The males are in breeding plumage. Everybody's beautiful. They're out and about. You can get around. We've got 50,000 acres of public land in the ACE Basin to come visit. So it's not a half a day trip.
Yeah.
And, that is a great time to come. You've got shorebird migration beginning. The bald eagles are around. You get a little bit later in the spring, and the waterfowl, of course, are leaving in early March. But then you got your spring migrants of warblers and shorebirds. And as you roll into March and spring is springing, Charleston is pretty, Savannah's pretty, Beaufort's pretty. So that is a really good season to come. Early in the fall, you've got, our waterfowl populations really don't start peaking a lot until November and December. A little bit harder to get on places to see them. But if you're a saltwater fisherman, October and November are really good. So there's never a bad time to be here, but the summertime and hurricane season are not the best.
Yeah, that's right. There's some added wild cards there that you want to try to avoid if you can. I understand that, living in Louisiana for a number of years. I get that completely. What are some of the public areas there? I'm assuming you've got some state WMAs as well as some national wildlife refuges.
We've got 3 major public South Carolina SCDNR managed properties, Dolly and Bear Island, which are 10 miles apart. That's 20,000 acres sandwiched together. That's the heart of the ACE. You've got 5,000 acres of managed wetlands, a lot of habitat diversity. You've got uplands, the whole schmeal. Nearby is the ACE Basin NWR, which has units on the Edisto and the Cumbie. And then another great management area, which is totally different, but is Botany Bay WMA down close to Edisto Beach, and it is subtropical. It gets shorebirds and wading birds and some waterfowl. I mean, I've seen pictures of people who saw long-tailed ducks in the saltwater impoundment down there, which, kind of a jump back moment.
Yeah.
And so there, a lot to do for people who, easy day trips from Charleston or Beaufort or nearby Walterboro. So there's a lot to do, and good time to come. Early spring is a good time to come.
I encourage people to put that on their list of destinations. Certainly once we all get back up and are able to move around the country and go to places that we want to go, I would encourage you to put that one on your list, the ACE Basin of coastal South Carolina. Dean, I want to thank you immensely for taking the time to share with us your knowledge, your expertise, and history of that region. Any final words from you that you want to leave the listeners with respect to this longstanding partnership?
Well, conservation is done by 1 acre at a time, and you just got to keep working at it. That's what I think.
Truer words have never been spoken. That's absolutely right, and it takes time, dedication. The ACE Basin partnership, the ACE Basin program, the task force, all the great work that they've done. I don't think it's any stretch to say that this is a flagship program in the South Atlantic region, and all of the accomplishments that have been made over the years are a testament to the courage, the passion of the people in that region, and yet another example of, I think we could say, the inspirational qualities of natural resources conservation. It gives people motivation. It gives people inspiration to do good things and leave a lasting legacy for those that come behind us. And so, Dean, again, thank you for all your work in that, and thank you for joining us on the show.
My pleasure.
A special thanks to our guest on today's show, Dean Harrigal, a consulting wildlife biologist with Folkland Management and retired employee of South Carolina DNR. He shared with us a lot of his expertise, experience, and involvement in a lot of the important wetland conservation work that's occurred in the ACE Basin of South Carolina. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great work that he does editing these podcasts and serving them up to you, the listeners. And of course, the listeners, you're the most important part of this effort. We thank you for spending your time with us, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.